The church was silent, except for the faint rustle of the bride's white gown brushing against the marble floor. The scent of roses filled the air, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows painting soft colors across the aisle. Everyone waited, but he never came. In the middle of that perfect, beautiful silence stood Grace Miller, blind, trembling, and alone. Her hands clutched the bouquet she could not see, her heart breaking in a world she could not picture. The whispers began like a cold breeze, spreading through the crowd. He's not coming. Before we go deeper into Grace's story, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and love that finds you when you least expect it, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more real, emotional stories like this one to life. Grace had always dreamed of her wedding day. Though she had lost her sight in a car accident at 18, she never lost her vision of love. Her fiancé, Aaron, had promised her that love was about seeing with the heart, not the eyes. They'd met 3 years ago at a support group for visually impaired individuals, and he had been everything she thought love could be. Gentle, patient, devoted. He told her that her blindness didn't matter, that he saw beauty in her courage, not just her face. For months, they planned the wedding together, her fingers tracing the lace on her gown, her smile bright when he described the church, the flowers, the sunset that would frame their vows. She believed she was about to begin a forever filled with warmth. But that morning, the warmth vanished. She could sense it even before she knew. He didn't show up to the final rehearsal. His phone was off. His best man's tone was strange when he spoke to her over breakfast, telling her not to worry. Yet something deep inside Grace, that quiet intuition that often replaced sight, whispered to her that something was wrong. Still, she waited. She dressed, she smiled, and she walked down the aisle guided by her father's trembling hand. She couldn't see the faces watching her, but she could feel the tension in the room, the uneasy silence when she reached the altar. Her heart pounded. She waited for the sound of Aaron's footsteps. She waited for his voice. Minutes passed, then a half hour. Then someone whispered softly in her ear that he wasn't coming. Grace didn't cry, not yet. Her world went utterly still. She stood frozen in that silent church, her fingers clutching the bouquet as if it were her only anchor to the world. Somewhere behind her, guests began to murmur, chairs scraping, sympathy mixed with shock. Her father tried to speak, but his voice broke. The priest lowered his head. Grace could feel her heart splintering quietly inside her chest, piece by piece. She wondered if everyone was staring at her. The blind bride left at the altar, the girl who couldn't see her own heartbreak coming. That night, she sat alone in her small apartment, her wedding gown still on because she didn't have the strength to take it off. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't read. Pity, outrage, gossip. She pressed her hand against her heart and felt the emptiness spreading. All she could think was, why wasn't I enough? Why would someone promise forever and walk away? The world outside went on. Cars passed, laughter echoed faintly through the city. But inside Grace's apartment, everything was still and broken. Days passed, and life blurred into numbness. Her father begged her to stay with him, but she refused. She wanted solitude, not sympathy. She began to avoid everyone, her friends, her co-workers, the kind neighbor who always brought her flowers. She didn't trust kindness anymore. She thought love was something meant for others, for people who could see beauty and be seen in return. The mirror in her room reflected nothing she could recognize, and the sound of her own breathing reminded her she was alone. Then, one rainy afternoon, when the sky felt as heavy as her heart, Grace heard a knock at her door. She hesitated, expecting a friend or maybe her father again. But the voice that spoke was unfamiliar, warm, calm, steady. "Hi," it said. "I'm Daniel. I just moved next door. I think one of your flower pots fell over onto my porch." She apologized, embarrassed, but he simply laughed softly. "No harm done," he said, "but I thought I'd check if you're okay." The sound was pretty loud. There was something genuine in his tone that made Grace pause. She hadn't spoken to a stranger in weeks, but something about him, Maybe the sincerity in his voice made her open the door slightly. Rain poured behind him, and she could hear the drops hitting his jacket. He offered to help her pick up the fallen pot, and she reluctantly let him in. As they crouched together, his voice filled the silence, gentle and easy. She didn't tell him her story that day, and he didn't ask. But when he left, he said, "If you ever need anything, even just company, I'm right next door." That night, for the first time in weeks, Grace didn't cry before sleeping. Over the next few days, Daniel kept his word. He'd check on her occasionally, sometimes bringing groceries or sharing a cup of coffee. He never treated her with pity, only respect. He didn't avoid mentioning her blindness, but he didn't make it her whole identity either. He talked about life, about music, about how he'd lost his sister years ago and how it changed him. Grace found herself listening, not just with her ears, but with her heart. His words painted images she could almost see. One evening, as they sat on her small balcony while rain whispered around them, Grace finally told him about her wedding. She spoke slowly, her voice trembling. She told him about the church, the waiting, the silence. When she finished, she expected him to offer the usual words, "I'm sorry," or "You deserve better." But he didn't. He just said softly, he walked away because he couldn't. See your strength. Some people are blind in ways that sight can't fix. Those words sank deep. Grace felt something shift inside her. A tiny spark of healing she hadn't known was still possible. Weeks turned into months. Daniel and Grace became inseparable friends. He'd take her to the park on sunny mornings, describing the flowers blooming around them, or read her books she once loved. She began to laugh again, to cook, to go outside. People started noticing the change in her. Her father said she sounded alive again. Grace didn't realize it at first, but Daniel had quietly become part of her world, the steady heartbeat her life had been missing. Still, love was a fragile word for Grace. She didn't trust it. She didn't want to. Every time she felt her heart stir when Daniel's hand brushed hers, she reminded herself of the church, of the silence, of the pain. But Daniel never rushed her. He just stayed, patient, kind, unshaken. Then, one spring evening, they attended a small music event together. Grace loved the sound of the piano, the way each note seemed to carry a piece of emotion. When the last song ended, Daniel turned to her and said quietly, "You know, Grace, I think some of the most beautiful things in life aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to be felt, like music, rain, or the warmth of someone's hand." And then very gently he took her hand. For a long moment, Grace didn't move. The memory of being left at the altar flashed in her mind, sharp and painful. But this time, the pain began to fade, because this wasn't the same. Daniel wasn't holding her hand out of pity. He was holding it out of choice, out of quiet understanding. Her heart swelled, and for the first time since her wedding day, she smiled without forcing it. From that day forward, Grace began to see, not with her eyes, but with something deeper. She saw the kindness in Daniel's laughter, the beauty in the morning sunlight that warmed her face, the hope in each new day. Love found her. Not in grand gestures or perfect moments, but in small acts of genuine care. 1 year later, Grace stood once again in a church, the same one she had been left in, but this time she wasn't trembling. She was radiant. Daniel stood beside her, his hand steady in hers. There were no whispers, no doubt, no emptiness. As the priest spoke, Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from pain but from gratitude. She couldn't see the colors of the stained glass or the faces of the guests, but she could feel every emotion in the room: warmth, love, hope. When they said their vows, Grace whispered softly, "You taught me to see again." Daniel smiled and replied, "And you taught me what it means to truly love." The guests rose to their feet as they walked down the aisle, not as a blind bride abandoned, but as a woman who had found light in her darkness. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Every act of kindness helps spread hope to someone who might need it today. Before we end, I'd love to know your thoughts. What part of Grace's journey moved you the most? Comment below. Your words mean more than you know. As they stepped out of the church into the golden sunlight, Grace turned her face toward the warmth she couldn't see, but could deeply feel. For the first time in a long time, she realized something profound. She might have lost her sight, but she had found her vision. Love, she learned, wasn't about what the eyes could witness, but what the soul could hold. And in that moment, when Daniel squeezed her hand and whispered, "You're home," Grace smiled. Because she finally was.